Morning. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Luke chapter 22. If you don't have one, there's a Bible beneath the chair in front of you or near you, and the page number on the screen behind me corresponds to that. If you've been with us the last few weeks, you know we've been talking about Jesus and his disciples in what many refer to as the Last Supper. And it was Jesus' Passover meal with the disciples in which he reframed what the bread means and what the wine means, how it represents him and his body and his blood. And it's also an invitation for us to participate with him in that. Then the meal is over. And in verse 39, it says this of Luke chapter 22. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel of heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation." If there's anything we can take at face value from this story, it's that Jesus did not want this to happen. Jesus had no interest in being sentenced to death. Jesus had no interest in being crucified. Jesus did not want this. And he's asking God to give him a way out. And I point this out because often when we talk about Jesus in the church, we diminish his humanity and we elevate his divinity. And in doing so, we can read stories like this and we kind of distance ourselves from them a little bit. Well, Jesus is Jesus. He had some kind of superpower that we don't have. Maybe it makes it a little bit difficult for us to connect with him and his story. But Jesus was a human being, just like you, just like me. And he knew where this whole thing was heading. Jesus occupied the role in his culture of a prophet. And it's well known within the Hebrew tradition that prophets were often killed by those in places of power that they were speaking to and speaking against. And the deaths that they died were often gruesome. You have the prophet Isaiah. History tells us that Isaiah was hauled in before the king and he was sawed in two. We're told that the prophet Jeremiah, because everyone was getting sick and tired of him, threw him in a cistern and he sunk into the mud, and they intended to leave him there until he starved to death, until eventually they took him out of the cistern and they shipped him down to Egypt, and there he was stoned to death. You have the recent prophet before Jesus, John the Baptist, who was beheaded. You have other prophets who were pushed off cliffs. All sorts of gruesome deaths. And Jesus is standing in the tradition of a prophet, and he knows what happens when you confront corrupt systems. You're going to pay for it, and oftentimes you're going to pay for it with your life. And he's saying to God, I don't want to do this. I don't want this. And in Jesus' immediate context, you had some of the Jewish authorities who had a lot of interest in making sure he was killed, except they, under Roman law, did not have the power or the authority to kill Jesus. They couldn't kill anyone. They had to leave that to the Romans. And if you were a non-Roman citizen and you were sentenced to death, that sentence meant that you were going to be crucified. And crucifixion was the worst, most brutal execution ever devised. Many believe it was devised by the Babylonians or maybe the Assyrians. The Persians used it widely, but they always say the Romans perfected it. Because when you were crucified, the intention was that they would keep you alive as long as possible to suffer while hanging on a cross. And typically those who did die from crucifixion often died from asphyxiation. And it was an awful form of punishment, and the Romans always made sure to do it in public places because it would dissuade other people in the empire from ever acting out against Rome. And so Jesus, that night in the garden, knows if it's going to be execution, it's going to be crucifixion. And he knows what that looks like. And so he says to God, take this cup from me. Take this cup that will lead to suffering and shame, in pain and death, in anguish, in agony. Take it from me. You see, as a human being, Jesus had desires. He had longings. He had hopes. And here we see him speaking freely to God about them, which is one of the things that I love about this story, is Jesus' honesty. In some ways, it's almost like we would rather have a Jesus that just says, I will do your will, without ever stating what he really wants. But that's not very human, is it? What we see here is Jesus being honest with God. And if it teaches us anything, it means that we too can be honest with God. How many of us in our everyday life just hold things in? Don't talk about them. Don't say them out loud. I remember years and years ago when my son was just old enough to start reading. I was sitting at our table one morning and I was journaling, as I often do, and he came over to ask me a question, and then he went, and I said, what? And his little hand pointed to the journal, which is the way I pray, to a swear word. And he was like, did you write that? And I said, yeah. When you're talking to God? Yeah. Because I think God can handle it. And I think it's the way, like the best way to express what I'm feeling. That oftentimes we've been trained that we have to present ourselves in a particular way to God, but what we see with Jesus and all of his humanity is him saying, no, here's what I want. Here's the way I wish it would go. If there's any other way, make it happen. And all of this, by the way, is happening on the Mount of Olives. By the way, does anyone know why it's called the Mount of Olives? Well, because there was a mountain there with olive trees. You thought it was going to be like some deep, no, it's just, this is the way ancients named places, by the way. Like you'd say to someone, like, where do you live? He's like, Big Rock. Like, where's that? You know that Big Rock? Yeah, it's right there. That was a Mount of Olives. It was an olive grove on the side of a mountain. The other gospel writers tell us more specifically that he went to a place called Gethsemane, which just means olive press. And archaeologists have uncovered an ancient olive press that dates to a little bit before the time of Jesus, that's just to the east of Jerusalem, and it's actually toward the bottom of the Mount of Olives, almost in the valley. And I've often wondered, why this detail? Why do we have to know where he's traveling to and going to? And many point toward this image of the olive press. You see, when olives were harvested, they still had the pits in them, and the thing that olives were used for mostly was olive oil, because olive oil was a very important resource in ancient Israel. And so they would harvest the olives, and the first thing they would do is put them in a big metal tub, and then they had stone tub, and then they had a big stone that they would use to grind the olives down, and they would crush all of them almost into a paste. And then they would take that paste and they would put it in baskets that were a little bit like burlap bags, and then they would stack those up, and they would lightly press them down, and then they would lower a pole that looks like a telephone pole over them, and then they would put one weight on the pole, and that was the first press. And that first press was considered the first fruits, and so that was always given to the temple. And then they'd put more weight on. That was the second press. And that was the oil that they would use for cooking and for baking. And then the worst of the press was the third, which they would use for their oil lamps and for soap and for other things. And so you hear this word olive press, and you think about the weight and the crushing and the pressing. And you read details like his sweat was dripping like drops of blood. And it's this image to evoke the intensity that Jesus is feeling in the moment. The anguish, the agony, all of the emotions being crushed and being pressed under the weight of it all. And yet in the midst of that intensity, in the midst of that weight, in the midst of his honesty, Jesus says, I don't want to do this, but I'm willing to do whatever you're asking of me. Not what I want, not what I will, but yours be done. That Jesus seems to be more interested in what God wants than what he wants. And I think that this points toward a function of prayer. And I think it might be important for us to consider, because often when we speak about prayer, we think about it in terms of like asking God for something. And that certainly is one part of prayer. I mean, when Jesus is asked to teach his disciples to pray, he says, give us this day our daily bread. That's asking God for provision. That's asking God for something. But often when I hear people speak about prayer, that's about as far as it goes. Should I ask? Should I not? And then there's like, well, what should I ask for? Have you ever heard the people that are like, man, we were going on vacation and it was supposed to be really bad weather, so we prayed that God would give us good weather, and it was sunny the whole time. I'm like, okay, you know there's millions of people starving, right? So God was like, oh, hang on, everybody. We got to get the sun shining over here. It just feels weird. Like, so do you pray for that? What about when people win a big game and they're like, you know, we prayed together that God would give us the victory. I'm like, God does not care about the NBA. And by the way, no one should care about the NBA. It's not basketball anymore. It's entertainment, just like WWE, but I digress. But you're like, so what do I pray for? And what about the really important things? Because I know someone who prayed for something really, really vitally important. And you know what? God said yes. God answered their prayer. And then I know someone else who prayed for something really, really important, and God didn't answer their prayer. God said no. So what do we do with that? I remember years ago, I was actually here up in my office, and I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, and they called 5 or 6 times, and I finally picked it up, and it was a chaplain at Children's Hospital out in Aurora. And he explained to me that there was a family who's a part of DCC whose child was in critical condition. They weren't sure he was even going to last the next few hours, and I was in my car and out there as fast as I could get there. And when I arrived, they were in the room with him, family was outside, I met the chaplain, and I said, can we go in and pray? Like, can we all go in? And the parents said, yeah. And we stood around the bed, and we held hands, and I looked at this child who was about 8 years old, and we began praying. And we prayed that God would heal him, that God would heal his body, that whatever was going on would be overcome. So we spent more time with the family after that in a room adjacent to the ICU room. And I eventually came back here, wondering if any of it mattered, to be honest with you. And before I got home that night, I got a call from the dad who said his fever broke. He woke up. He's coming back. They think he's going to be great. They think he's going to make it. And he's a sophomore in college today. I had another time where I was invited to be with a family whose brother was certainly going to pass away. And I went to the hospital, and he was in ICU. When I got there, the family was there. There was a lot of fear, uncertainty. And we went in and we stood around the bed and we prayed. And I spent time with the family after. And 2 days later, the dad called me and said, our son passed away. What happened in this room that didn't happen in this room? Like, does God answer prayer sometimes, but not all the time? And how does God make up his mind about that? Was there something that happened here that we missed here? You see, these kind of questions about prayer begin to surface when we look at it mainly as a vehicle for asking God for things. And they're good questions. And to be honest with you, I don't know why I've prayed over people with the company of others and seen them miraculously healed and done the same thing here and watched the person pass away. I don't know why God answers some prayers and seemingly doesn't answer others. And I'm very suspicious of people who pretend to have the answer to some of those questions, especially when they give easy answers to things of great depths and make it sound good by attaching a Bible verse to it. I don't know. And there's some who say, well, you need to pray with more faith. You need to pray with God's will. Or maybe you were praying for the wrong thing. And I'm like, well, whatever answer you would like to give, that's fine. But I encourage you then, please apply it to this story that we read this morning, because God seemingly did not answer Jesus' prayer. Jesus prayed for something very specific. Let this cup pass from me. And God seemingly said, nope. And so if we're going to go with some of the normal explanations, did Jesus not have enough faith? Was Jesus praying outside of God's will? Was Jesus in a place where he was praying for the wrong thing? Or maybe there's something else going on here with Jesus' prayer. Something that led him to a place where he seemed more concerned with what God wanted than what he wanted. And this is what points toward this function of prayer. You see, when Jesus says, not what I want, but what you want, he's not doing like the teenager thing, sorry, Ing students, where you ask your teenager to clean their room for the 17th time and they go, okay. I never understand why the comes at the end of it. My kids always used to say, no. And I'd be like the guy who built the boat and had all the animals. Which, by the way, when your kid is angry with you and as a parent you start mocking them, it always goes super well. It's a great parenting technique. I actually am writing a book about it right now. And so you know how it is. They stomp upstairs to clean their room, and you're like, yeah, you're doing what I told you to do, but you actually have no interest in doing what I told you to do. That's not where Jesus is. Jesus is also not in the place of like, oh, fine, I'll never change your mind. I guess I'll go along with it. Like, that's just passive resignation to fate. I think when Jesus says this, he's earnest. He means it. He understands in that moment that he actually is a part of God's work in the world, that Jesus is the answer to his prayer. That Jesus is the vehicle for God's work in this world, no matter what it's going to cost him. There's some scholars that talk about this idea of cup. Let this cup pass from me. And often we read that and think, oh, this is the cup of God's wrath. God is going to pour out God's wrath on Jesus on the cross so Jesus can take it all and kind of make sure no one else takes it. And they're like, yeah, but that's one image of cup. There's multiple images of cups, and one of those is the cup of salvation. That in some ways, Jesus begins to recognize that maybe this cup is this cup of salvation, that what I'm about to endure and go through is going to bring salvation to the world, to the universe, to everything, to all things. You see, this is not Jesus doing what God's telling him to do, even though he doesn't want to do it. It's not him resigning to fate. It's him agreeing with God to be a participant in God's work in the world. That somehow Jesus hears this as an invitation to work with God. That Jesus ultimately is open to whatever God has in mind. And he sees himself as a participant in the unfolding work of God that's happening right here, right now, in the middle of our world. And maybe that's this function of prayer, is that it changes us. Is that we can say, I don't want to do this. And in the next breath say, but I'm open to whatever it is you want to do in me and through me. There's a wonderful Benedictine nun named Sister Joan Chitziter, which, by the way, saying that name publicly takes a lot of guts. During our sound check this morning, there was people were betting on is Michael going to blow it and say the wrong word? Some of you haven't listened to anything I've said right up until now, and you're like, what did he just say? Chittister, that's it. Okay, Hannah's got my back. Hannah was one of the ones rooting for me to blow it. Nonetheless, Sister Joan Chittister talks about the function of prayer, and she says this: the function of prayer is to change my own mind, to put on the mind of Christ, to enable grace to break into me. Prayer leads us to see our world through the eyes of God. It unstops our ears to hear the poverty of widows, the loneliness of widowers, the cry of women, the vulnerability of children, the struggle of outcasts, the humanity of enemies, the insights of the uneducated, the tensions of bureaucrats, the fears of rulers, the wisdom of the holy, the power of the powerless. Prayer leads us, enlevens us, and enlightens us, and changes us. It makes us something bigger than we are. Prayer is a constant reminder that we do not go to church for ourselves alone. And yet it is not that there's no room for the self here. It's just that the self grows best when self is not its end. That prayer is ultimately putting on the mind of Christ, allowing our heart to be reshaped into the heart of Christ, looking at the world through God's filter and not our own, and beginning to see and discern and understand what is it that God is doing in the world and how can we join God in it regardless of what it will cost me. This, says Sister Joan, this is the function of prayer. Abraham Joshua Heschel says it's precisely the function of prayer to shift the center of living from self-consciousness to self-surrender. That we are actively being reshaped by God in our communion with Him. And this is what we see happening in Jesus. This is what I want, but I'm willing to do whatever it is that you're inviting me to do in the world. I mean, imagine just the idea that God's inviting you and me to work with God in the world. You see, if there's anything I think that we've done, especially in the church in America, and especially in wealthier churches in America, is we've set the bar really low. I understand when people are like, I'm not interested in going to church. I'm like, yeah, I get it, because if that's all it is, it's boring. You're paying someone or something somewhere for a building and some lights and everything else, and then you just kind of show up. Oh, and then there's the rules, that you're supposed to obey, that none of us really do. But then we act like we do when we show up, and then, we can just mildly judge the people that don't. Oh, and then there's the beliefs, the things that you're supposed to mentally assent to and check off the list. And honestly, a Christianity like that and a religion like that seems so boring. I'm not surprised people are leaving the church left and right. But a life in which God invites us to work with Him in the world? Sign me up. Maybe this is what Paul meant in his letter to the church, and he said, we are co-workers with Christ. That's where we get the word synergy. That you're taking the strengths of more than one source and putting them together to do something in the world. And the reality is the more we give ourselves to that, the more that we agree and heed the invitation of God to work with God in the world, the more we realize we actually need to pray. Because we can't do this on our own. We actually need each other. Because no individual can do it. We actually need to center ourselves around something bigger than any one of us to remind ourselves of this invitation that we're being given day in and day out. And maybe this is what Jesus saw. This is what Jesus understood. That yes, I have my desires and my wants and my longings, and be honest about that. But also allow prayer to do its work, to allow grace to break into us so that we can say like Jesus, it's not what I want, but what you want, and I'll join you in your work in the world. This week, as I was putting the finishing touches, we might say, on this sermon, I was trying to think about, like, as we say in the preacher world, how to land the plane. And one of the things that came to my head was this proverb that I've said many times of, don't ask God to feed the hungry family down the street when you have a cupboard full of food. That you can actually be the answer to the prayer, God, feed them, just by actually putting a bag together and walking down and knocking on their front door and saying, here. And as I was thinking through this, I received an email from Joel Carlman. Joel is our executive director of Project Renew and our outreach pastor here at DCC. And he sent an email about immigrants in our city. Now, if you're here and you're like, oh boy, here we go, we're getting political. I want to share a couple of things. The first time we talked about immigration at Denver Community Church and our immigrant siblings was somewhere around 16 years ago. And the reason we talked about it is the Bible talks about it, and we try to talk about the Bible. So we talked about it. And you know what was really interesting? We had people that were like, whoa, this is fascinating. I've never heard this talked about. 12 years ago, I was in the city of Chicago for a meeting of faith leaders from all over the country. We're talking liberal leaders and conservative leaders, black, white, and brown leaders, men and women leaders, all leaders of Christian faith communities who came together to talk about what should the church's response be to immigration. And you know what? There was no explosive language. There was no one accusing anyone else of doing this or that. And in a refreshing twist, no one talked about partisan politics or who was in office. We actually began to say, what is it that God's calling us to do as churches? And I start there because that's the heart behind us here at DCC, is not to play partisan politics where we use people who are in a vulnerable place as political tools to get elected. We've been in this conversation for a long time, and I think the reason it's gotten so sideways, quite frankly, is because the church has largely ceded its responsibility to politicians and to the media personalities, and they're the ones that we look to tell us what to do and believe. Thank you. Yes. And for us, what we say is no. We want to together to be asking God, what is it you're doing in the world and how can we join you in this? Which is why we've been in this work for so long. And so I get an email from Joel, and he says, hey, we have some things that we've put together as Project Renew so that we can support those immigrants in our city who are feeling particularly vulnerable at the moment. And I saw that and I immediately thought, oh, we're going to talk about this on Sunday. Because it wasn't just, hey, we need to pray for our immigrant friends in the city who are feeling vulnerable. Surely we're going to do that, and surely we are doing that. But it's also saying, if we're going to pray for that, how do we become participants in the work that God is doing and become an answer to the prayer that we're praying? So we have a QR code I'm going to put up here on the screen, and you can scan it if you'd like. But there's two groups that we want to talk about this morning. One is the Colorado Immigrant Justice Fund. It was something that we were actually a part of launching back in 2020. And I have notes from Joel because I didn't want to butcher this. It's a group that we helped launch in 2020 until they became their own 501c3. And what the Colorado Immigrant Justice Fund does is that they raise funds so that they can pay attorneys a much reduced fee that the attorneys agree to represent those who are seeking asylum in our country. Because the percentages of them being granted asylum when being represented by an attorney who speaks their mother tongue and English skyrockets. It was actually started by two people, and I think I don't know where he is. He's here somewhere, and he won't raise his hand. He's getting pointed at. Greg, right there in the back, is the one who started it. And Greg, man, he's a guy that participates. And Colorado Immigrant Justice Fund is now its own 501c3, and we as a church are giving them $10,000 right now toward a $50,000 matching grant. And we want to say, hey, this is how we want to participate. Our other partner is JAMLAC. It's the Justice and Mercy Legal Aid Clinic, and they exist to give legal aid to people who are in vulnerable places who otherwise would not able to be represented or would not able to get that representation. And we are providing $1,500 worth of food and groceries for 5 asylum-seeking families, and we're tripling our monthly financial support of them. And this QR code will teach you or show you other ways that you can get involved, that we can actually practically act out what we've been talking about this morning. That we're not just going to be people who say, well, we'll pray about it. But we'll say to God, what is it that you're doing? Because we're open and ready and willing to participate with you in whatever you have in mind. Joel, thank you. Joel's going to be in the back corner at the participate area after if you'd like to speak with him. Can you stand up, Joel, just so people know who you are? Beautiful. Yeah. But when we talk here at DCC about exploring and participating in the life of Jesus so that we can be a healing presence in this world, this is exactly what we mean. And my hope for you and for me and for all of us is that we would continue to be people who pray, so that we would more and more and more take on the mind of Christ and the heart of Christ, that we would see our world with God's eyes and hear with God's ears, so that as we work together as co-workers with Christ, we would indeed be a healing presence in our world. Let's pray together. God, I recognize that to pray with Jesus is a costly prayer. And I ask that you would continue to reshape, to move, to evolve, grow, and change our hearts so that we would not just be those who tell you what we want, but we would also be those who are open and willing to hear what it is you want, and that we would agree to participate with you in your work in this world. We pray these things together in the strong name of Jesus. And all my friends said, well, each and every week here at DCC, we participate in Eucharist. This meal that Jesus had with his disciples when he said, here's my body broken for you, and here's my blood shed for you. And we, as Paul called us, are that body. And so this morning, as we talk about this idea of being invited and participating in God's work in the world, I invite us to consider, what does it mean for us to be broken open and poured out for our world? This table is not the table of Denver Community Church. It's the table of Jesus, which is why we invite anyone who wants to come to participate, because Jesus always made more room at the table. As you come forward, we ask if you'd like to come to the middle sections that you'd use the middle aisle. If you want to go to the sides, use the side aisle, and return to your seats using the diagonal aisle. For those of you with children down on DCC Kids, we invite you to, if you want, to get them and so that they can participate with you, because we believe this is a meal for all of us to participate in together. And as we prepare ourselves, may you hear these words from the Gospel of Matthew. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, And when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins."